Number 3. Michael Poland. 57-year-old Russell Dempsey and 52-year-old Cecil Newkirk were armored van drivers with Purelator. On the morning of May 24, 1977, they set off from their depot in Phoenix, Arizona. They were supposed to drop off money at banks in Prescott, Sedona, and Flagstaff, but they never made it to the first bank. The bank reported that they didn't show up, and the company tried to radio the men. They did not get a response from the men. The police were called in, and they thought that Dempsey and Newkirk might have taken off with the money. The police interviewed their families, and they said that the men did not have any financial troubles. Purelator also doubted that they stole the money. Both Dempsey and Newkirk have been employees for 20 years, and they never had a problem with them. The next day, the armored van they were driving was found off the interstate near the ghost town of Bumblebee. Dempsey and Newkirk were nowhere to be found. About $293,000 in paper money was missing from the van. Around $34,000 in coins were left behind. Blood was also found in the back of the van. The van was equipped with several tools that could have been used in the event of a robbery. This included a radio and a shotgun. But neither Dempsey nor Newkirk used the radio, and the shotgun was still holstered with the safety on. At this point, the FBI was called in to take over the case. FBI agents found 2 sets of large shoe prints near the van, so they concluded that 2 men were probably involved in the robbery. The FBI asked people who were driving on Interstate 77 near Bumblebee on the morning of the robbery to come forward if they had any information. Several people contacted them and said that they saw the armored van on the side of the interstate. It appeared that it had been pulled over by an officer with the Arizona Department of Safety. The officer was driving what appeared to be an Arizona Department of Safety car with lights on the roof. The FBI checked with the Arizona Department of Safety, and none of their officers recorded pulling the van over that morning. The FBI concluded that 2 men disguised as officers had the van pulled over on the side of the interstate. The dirt in the area where the van was pulled over showed signs that there was probably a struggle. The FBI theorized that Dempsey and Newkirk were forced into the back of the van, and then one of the robbers took over driving the van. They drove off the interstate and loaded the money into a second vehicle. But as to who the robbers were and what happened to Dempsey and Newkirk were mysteries. About 3 weeks later, 2 men were fishing on Lake Mead, about 250 miles from where the van was found. They made a horrifying discovery. They found a human body that had been shoved inside a canvas sack floating on the surface of the water. The sack had been weighted down with rocks. The men who found the body got in contact with the police. In the dead man's pants was his wallet, making it easy for the police to identify the body. It was one of the missing guards, Russell Dempsey. The FBI was called in, and they had divers search the water where the body was found. In the water, they found a homemade garrote. The medical examiner determined that Dempsey had a heart attack. He had also been strangled, most likely with the garrote. The FBI concluded that in order to get the body to that part of the lake, the killers probably rented a boat. What the divers didn't find was the body of Cecil Newkirk. The FBI decided to send an agent to interview people who worked at service stations between Lake Mead and Bumblebee. There were hundreds of service stations, but amazingly, the FBI lucked out. The first service station the agent went to, the owner had some information to share. The man owned a service station near Lake Mead. He said that on the day after the robbery, he got a call from two men whose truck had become stuck in the sand on the shore of Lake Mead. He drove his tow truck to the area where the men were stuck. The two men said that they had been fishing and drinking, and their truck got stuck in the sand. The owner of the service station noted that they didn't have any fishing gear. After he pulled the truck out of the sand, he had one of the men sign a receipt. The owner of the service station gave the receipt to the FBI agent. The receipt was signed by Michael Poland, who lived in Prescott, Arizona. The FBI went to the area where the truck was towed out of the sand. They did a search of that area of the lake, and they found the body of Cecil Newkirk. He had been put into a canvas sack, which was weighted down with rocks. He had been severely beaten, but he was most likely alive when he was dumped into the water. Also in the lake, near the body, the police found another canvas sack. This one contained 2 handguns and a license plate that was similar to those used by the Arizona Department of Safety. The FBI began to investigate Michael Poland. It turned out that he had rented a boat on Lake Mead the day after the robbery. As the FBI surveilled Michael, they noticed that he and his brother, Patrick Poland, spent a lot of time with each other. The brothers didn't have jobs, and before the robbery, they had financial problems. But as the FBI watched them, they seemed to spend money freely. After the robbery, Michael bought 2 new motorcycles, and Patrick purchased a new car. Both brothers have been able to pay off debts, and they made other large purchases. They pay for everything with cash. Several months after the robbery, in July 1977, the FBI searched the homes of both brothers. In Michael's home, they found $12,000 in cash, and in Patrick's home, they found $16,000. Although the FBI strongly suspected that Michael and Patrick committed the robbery and murders, they felt that they only had circumstantial evidence and they did not have enough physical evidence to arrest them. So for nearly a year, the FBI watched Michael and Patrick Poland. An FBI agent who worked on the case thought that the canvas bags that the bodies were placed into were their best lead. The bags were unusual and possibly custom made. The FBI agent checked with stores in the Phoenix area, and one store owner recognized the bags. The FBI checked the store's paperwork, and they found an order form for the 3 bags that was placed a month before the robbery. The name on the order form was an alias that they knew Michael Poland used. They had evidence that he used the same alias to purchase stun guns that were used in the robbery. After the bodies were found, the canvas bags were examined by the FBI, and they found cement dust in the creases. They compared that dust to the cement dust found in the bed of Patrick and Michael's father's truck. It was a match. The FBI finally felt like they had enough evidence to arrest the brothers. The FBI thought that Patrick and Michael would try to shoot it out instead of going peacefully. But in May 1978, a year after the double murder and robbery, the FBI were able to arrest both brothers without incident. In February 1979, Michael and Patrick were convicted on federal charges of kidnapping and robbery, and they were sentenced to 100 years in prison. Then in November 1979, They were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder at the state level, and they were both sentenced to death. They appealed their murder convictions, and they were overturned. They went to trial again in 1982. Once again, they were found guilty, and again, they were sentenced to die. For 17 years, the brothers sat on death row. Their lawyers appealed their death sentences several times. One of the appeals that was placed on Michael's behalf said that he should not be executed because he was not mentally coherent. Several doctors said that he was delusional, but the brothers lost their appeals. On June 16, 1999, Michael Pollan was brought into the execution chamber. He was asked for his last statement, and he said, "I'd like to know if you're going to bring me lunch afterward. I'm really hungry. I can't think of anything else." He was then strapped to the table, and the lethal injection process began. The 59-year-old was pronounced dead minutes later. Less than a year later, on March 15, 2000, Patrick Pollan was executed as well. His last statement was, "If I may, once again, to the Newkirk and Dempsey families, please accept my apologies. I'm sincere. I'm sorry for the pain and suffering I have caused. I do thank you for your forgiveness. I ask my family to forgive me for the pain I have caused them. I ask all my friends and people who believed in me to please forgive me, and I ask the woman I love to remember I will always love her." Number 2. Douglas Feldman. Douglas Feldman was born in June 1958 in Texas. From a young age, it was clear that Feldman was intelligent, but he also had some serious anger issues. As a child, his mother would tell him to do chores around the home. He would refuse and they would argue. Sometimes he would grab a large knife and threaten to stab her. He also used to break into the homes of neighbors. One time he stole a gun from a neighbor's home. Then one day, he and his older brother got into an argument and Feldman pulled a gun on him. Feldman was first arrested when he was just 11 years old. When he was 16 years old, he was working at a gas station. While working there, he stole one of the customers' credit card numbers and used it to make a large purchase. The customer figured out that Feldman stole his credit card numbers. He offered not to press charges if Feldman repaid him. But Feldman refused his offer and acted like he did nothing wrong. 2 years later, in January 1978, Feldman, armed with a gun, stole drugs from a pharmacy. He was arrested and he spent 2 years in jail. When Feldman got out of jail, he went to university, and every year he was on the dean's list. After he graduated, he got a job as a financial analyst with a hospital. He worked at that job for 8 years and then decided to quit so that he could travel. He traveled around South America and he even went to Antarctica. After a year, he ran out of money and he returned to Texas. In December 1996, Feldman got into an argument with a fellow motorist who was driving a restored 1984 Firebird. Feldman smashed up the Firebird with his Land Rover, and he hit the driver of the Firebird 3 times in the head with a ball-peen hammer. Luckily, the driver of the Firebird wasn't too seriously injured. He sued Feldman and won a settlement of $8,500. Feldman didn't serve any jail time for the assault. About a year and a half later, Feldman went to a drive-in hamburger restaurant in Dallas, Texas. He sat in his car and ordered some food from a car hop. When the car hop returned with his food, he told her that he forgot his wallet and he didn't have any money on him. She told him that if he didn't have any money, then he couldn't have the food. Feldman flew into a rage and he slammed into the car hop with his car. She flew 20 feet in the air and was knocked unconscious. She ultimately survived the assault. Several months later, on the night of August 23, 1983, Feldman went to a Volkswagen dealership in Richardson, Texas, after it had closed for the day. He fired 8 bullets into the showroom and at cars on the lot. In total, he did about $8,000 worth of damage. At the time, the police had no idea that Feldman shot up the car lot. The next night, Feldman was riding his Harley-Davidson motorcycle near Plano, Texas. He claimed that an 18-wheeler transport truck cut him off. Feldman was furious over this, so he pulled out his 9mm handgun and started shooting at the trailer. Once he unloaded the gun, he reloaded it and started shooting again. As he shot, he drove to the front of the truck. When he got to the front of the truck, he shot the driver, 36-year-old Robert Stephen Everett. Several bullets entered Everett's body, and his truck rolled to a stop on the side of the road. He died in the cab of his truck. Even though he had just killed a man, Feldman was still angry. He drove into Dallas, and 40 minutes after he killed Everett, he came across 62-year-old Nicholas Velasquez. Velasquez worked for Exxon, and he was just a few weeks from retirement. When Feldman found him, he was filling up a gas station's supply tanks. Feldman drove up behind him and fired 6 shots. Velasquez was hit 3 times in the back, and he was killed. Nearly 2 weeks later, on September 5th, Antonio Vega was driving his transport truck in Dallas. At around noon, he stopped outside of a Jack in the Box restaurant so that he could use a payphone. As he was standing next to his truck talking on the phone, Feldman drove up to him in his Land Rover and started shooting at him with his 9mm handgun. Vega was shot several times. Feldman then drove off, leaving Vega to die. Since it was the middle of the day, there were several witnesses to the shooting. One of them called 911, and Vega was transported to the hospital. He luckily survived his wounds. One of the witnesses wrote down Feldman's license plate, and he gave it to the police. On the same day that Vega was shot, Feldman was arrested. In his possession, the police found the 9mm handgun that was used in all 3 shootings. Feldman confessed to the 2 murders and to shooting Vega. While he awaited trial, he wrote letters to friends and family which showed that he had no remorse for what he had done. It was also clear from his letters that he was a very angry man. He wrote, "I will tell you this, I found it quite pleasurable to kill those 2 men. If you are an angry person and someone provokes you to violence, it feels wonderful to cause their death and to watch their pain. After the adrenaline is gone, the sense of satisfaction and personal accomplishment is also gone." Douglas Feldman went to trial in September 1999, and he was convicted of both murders and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. While Feldman was on death row, he continued to write letters to his friends and family. He wrote to several people that he thought that murder should be legal. He also wrote about his hatred of people in general, and he shared his violent fantasies. He wrote that he hated truckers because they polluted the air and ran over deer. Feldman appealed his death sentence several times, but he was unsuccessful every time. On July 31, 2013, the families of Robert Stephen Everett and Nicholas Velasquez, among other people, gathered at the Huntsville prison. Just after 6 p.m., Douglas Feldman, who spent nearly 14 years on death row, was led into the execution chamber. He was asked if he had a last statement. During last statements, it is common for condemned prisoners to tell their families that they love them or they apologize to the victim's family. Feldman had a different idea. Feldman said, "I hereby declare Robert Stephen Everett and Nicholas Velasquez guilty of crimes against me, Douglas Allen Feldman. Either by fact or by proxy, I find them both guilty. I hereby sentence both of them to death, which I carried out in August of 1998. As of that time, the state of Texas has been holding me illegally in confinement and by force for 15 years. I hereby protest my pending execution and demand immediate relief." Of course, no one listened to his demand. At 6:15 p.m., the lethal injection process began. 13 minutes later, 55-year-old Douglas Feldman was pronounced dead. Number 1. Barbara Graham. In 1953, Mabel Monahan was 64 years old, and she lived alone in a house in Burbank, California. Monahan, who was a widow, seemed paranoid. All of her windows had latches on them, and her doors were double bolted. She had floodlights that lit up her front and backyards. She turned them on every day at nightfall, and she turned them off when she woke up. At night, she also kept her curtains drawn so no one could see inside her home. Shortly after 11 a.m. on March 11, 1953, her gardener arrived at her property to do his weekly work. He noticed that the floodlights were on and the curtains were still drawn, which he thought was odd. He went to the front door and found it ajar. He knocked, but there was no answer. He let himself in, and he saw that the home had been ransacked. He made his way to the living room, and he saw some blood splatter. He ran out of the house and found a phone, which he used to call the police. Inside the house, the police found the dead body of Mabel Monahan. She was fully clothed, her hands were bound behind her back, and there was a pillowcase over her head. When an officer removed the pillowcase, he saw that she had been hit several times in the head with a blunt object. There was also a strip of cloth that was tied around her neck. The police thought she had been beaten to death, but an autopsy revealed that the cause of death was strangulation. The police searched the house, and they found about $5,000 in cash in Monahan's purse, which was in her bedroom closet. On a dressing table in the same room, they found a box with jewelry, estimated to be worth about $10,000. The police were a bit baffled by the crime scene. They didn't think that robbery was the motive, since the killer, or killers, left the money and the jewelry behind. But based on the ransacking, it was clear that the killer, or killers, were looking for something. About a week after the murder, the police got a tip that a man named Willie Shorter may have been involved in the home invasion. Shorter was a henchman of reputed mobster Mickey Cohen. The police interviewed Shorter, and he admitted to being at Monahan's home on the night she died, but denied killing her. He said that there was a rumor that Monahan had a safe with $100,000 in her home. Monahan's daughter and her husband used to live in the home. Monahan's son-in-law was a notable gambler with rumored ties to the mob. Supposedly, he left the safe with the money behind when he and Monahan's daughter moved out. Shorter said that he got involved in plans to steal the money. He said that on the day of the murder, a man named John picked him up. A second car with two men and a woman followed them. Shorter said he wasn't sure what the names of the three people in the second car were. He thought the men's names were Emmett and Jack, and the woman's name was Mary. They pulled up in front of Monahan's home, and they had the woman knock on the door. When Monahan opened the door, Mary, John, Jack, and Emmett forced their way in. Shorter said that he stayed in the car by himself. After a few minutes, he heard a woman scream. He went into the house, and he was horrified to see what they had done to Monahan. They ultimately left without getting any money. It turned out that there was no safe with $100,000 in it, and the robbers missed the purse and the jewelry. Shorter said that 2 days later, he read in the newspaper that Monahan had died. Shorter said that he didn't know the last names of his accomplices, but he gave descriptions of Emmett, Jack, John, and Mary. The police looked through the records and came up with a possible match to one of the men described by Shorter. He was 45-year-old Emmett Perkins. Perkins had done time for robbery, and the police knew that he ran a gambling parlor in El Monte, California. Emmett had an associate named John Santo, and the police thought that he was the man named Jack. Santo also had a bad reputation. He was the lead suspect in the murder of a gold miner. The police then concluded that the man named John who was involved in the robbery and the murder was one of Santos's friends, a man named John True. One of Emmett Perkins' employees of the gambling parlor was a 29-year-old woman named Barbara Graham. The police thought she was most likely the woman that Shorter thought was named Mary. Barbara's job at the gambling parlor was to encourage men to make bigger and bigger bets. Barbara had somewhat of a shady background, and she had served time in prison, but not for any violent crimes. Barbara was born in June 1923 in Oakland, California. When Barbara was born, her mother, Hortense, was 17 years old. Hortense did not keep in contact with Barbara's father. Hortense treated Barbara like a nuisance and often left her with relatives while she continued to go out and party. A year later, Hortense gave birth to another daughter. Just like with Barbara's father, Hortense didn't stay in contact with the father of her second daughter. It's suspected that Hortense supported herself and her two young daughters through sex work. A few months after the birth of her second daughter, Hortense was sent to a reform school, and she spent several years at the school. Not long after Hortense got out of the reform school, she became pregnant for the third time. This time, she married the father of the child. But tragically, he got sick and died 2 months before his son was born. Hortense struggled to raise her 3 children. She would often dump them with friends, family, and sometimes complete strangers. Barbara and her sister were in and out of state schools until Barbara was 12. Then Barbara was sent to public school, but she didn't go very often. She was eventually sent to the same reform school that her mother had been forced to go to. Barbara was released from the reform school in 1939 and not long afterward, when she was just 16, she got married. She and her husband had a son together, and then the marriage started to fall apart. As they were splitting up, Barbara became pregnant for a second time. Barbara gave birth to a second son, but it's not clear if her husband was the father. Nevertheless, he treated the boy like it was his son, and he gave him his last name. When they got divorced, Barbara's husband was awarded custody of the two boys. After the divorce, Barbara made money as a sex worker, and she had several run-ins with the law. She spent 5 years in prison for perjury after she gave fake alibis for two friends. After getting out of prison, she got married 2 more times, but neither marriage lasted long. In November 1950, at the age of 27, she got married for a 4th time to a man named Henry Graham. Barbara met Henry when he was a bartender. He had hired her to be an escort at the bar. Henry found that men tipped better if they were being chatted up by an attractive woman. Henry was addicted to gambling, and he had a criminal record. Through Henry, Barbara met Emmett Perkins. Perkins hired Barbara to lure dates from Henry's bar and bring them to his gambling parlor. Barbara found herself pregnant again, and in February 1952, she gave birth to a 3rd son. Not long after giving birth, she went back to work at the gambling parlor where she encouraged men to make bets. While working there, she met John Santo, who frequented the parlor. Sometimes Santo would spend the night in a bedroom at the back of the parlor. In early 1953, Barbara and Henry's marriage started to fall apart, and Barbara began to sleep at the gambling parlor. It's rumored that she and Santo started a sexual relationship. Not long after Santo and Barbara met, Mabel Monahan was murdered in her home. A month after, Willie Shorter told the police he went to Monahan's home with 3 men and a woman. It was leaked to the press that he was cooperating with the police. On April 14, 1953, Shorter was kidnapped from his home at gunpoint by 2 men. He has never been found, and it is assumed that he was murdered. It is suspected that John Santo and Emmett Perkins killed him. A month after Shorter disappeared, the police arrested Santos' friend, John True. True agreed to turn state's evidence. In exchange for immunity, he would testify against Santo, Perkins, and Barbara. Not long after True agreed to testify, Santo, Perkins, and Barbara were arrested and charged with the murder of Mabel Monahan. Graham's trial started on August 18, 1953, and she was a media sensation. The star witness at the trial was John True. True testified that Barbara was the ringleader. She was the one who came up with the idea to knock on Monahan's door and say that she had car trouble. True also said that Barbara was the person who beat Monahan. He testified that she pistol whipped the 64-year-old woman in the head. The district attorney also presented evidence that Barbara had been married 4 times. Then a woman named Donna Prow, who was in jail with Barbara, testified. Prow told the court that she offered to give Barbara an alibi for the night of the murder because Barbara didn't have an alibi. Then the prosecutor showed letters between Barbara and Prow that strongly suggested that they had a jailhouse romance. Prow was in jail for vehicular manslaughter. For testifying against Barbara, Prow was given a deal where she would be released on time served. The prosecutor also told the jury that Barbara worked as a prostitute and she worked at a gambling parlor. Barbara then got on the stand and testified that she had nothing to do with the deadly home invasion. In his closing statement, Barbara's lawyer pointed out that there was no physical evidence that she was at the crime scene. The only evidence that she was there was John True's testimony. Her lawyer said that True's testimony was self-serving because he got immunity. Barbara's lawyer also pointed out that being married 4 times, working at a gambling parlor, and being a sex worker were not evidence that she killed anyone. Nevertheless, Barbara was found guilty and she was sentenced to death. Emmett Perkins and John Santo were also found guilty and they were also sentenced to die. Barbara, Perkins, and Santos were all scheduled to die in the gas chamber on June 3, 1955, less than 2 years after they were convicted. Barbara was supposed to be executed first at 10 a.m., but her lawyer made several last-minute attempts to save her life. As a result, the execution was postponed by an hour and a half. During the delay, Barbara said, "Why did they torture me? I was ready to go at 10 o'clock." At 11:28 a.m., Barbara was led into the gas chamber in San Quentin prison. She did not want to look at the people in the gallery, so she was blindfolded. She was asked for a last statement, and she said, "Good people are always so sure they're right." She was strapped to the chair in the gas chamber, and one of the guards told her to count to 10 and then take a deep breath. He said it would be easier that way. Barbara supposedly said, "How the hell would you know that?" At 11:34, the gas chamber was closed and the cyanide pellets dropped. At 11:42, Barbara Graham, who was 3 weeks shy of her 32nd birthday, was pronounced dead. At 2:30 p.m. that same day, Emmett Perkins and John Santo were sealed in the same gas chamber where Barbara died hours earlier. Perkins, who was 47, died after 6 minutes, and Santo, who was 54, died a minute later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallist.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. Well, that's all for today. Thank you again for watching.